As President of the International Scientific Committee on Intangible Cultural Heritage, I take this opportunity to congratulate everyone involved in the establishment of this new NSC and the organisation of this symposium. I regret I can't be with you in person, but my field trip working with Aboriginal people in a remote part of Cape York Peninsula was pushed back due to sorry business in the community, and it was no longer possible to make the travel connections from our base camp on the headwaters of the Jackson River into Melbourne in time. Intangible cultural heritage has emerged as a growing field of research, investigation and documentation across the world as people race to have their cultural practices recognised, celebrated and conserved. At the inaugural gathering of the Australian National Scientific Committee, I think it's important to remember the international context within which the NSC exists. Since the adoption by UNESCO of the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2003, 161 countries have become signatories, although notably and sadly, Australia is not one of these. And there have been 282 entries on the register, although of course none from Australia, New Zealand, the USA or Canada. The Convention defines intangible cultural heritage as the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge and skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artefacts and cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups and in some cases individuals recognise as their cultural heritage. There's a whole structure to support and pursue the objects of this convention, all including regular meetings of state parties to which ICOMOS is invited as an observer. However, we, that is the ISC and now your NSC, are not an integral part of the structure. We are established under the ICOMOS statutes to work towards the goals and objectives of ICOMOS. What does this mean? And how do we make an effective contribution in this area? Well, the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Intangible Cultural Heritage was established in 2005 by a strategically focused group of ICOMITES, which included past President Marilyn Truscott, who may well be with you there today. These people saw the importance of exploring how this emerging area of heritage endeavour intersected with ICOMOS's mission to conserve cultural heritage places. While the UNESCO Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage does not totally exclude the role of buildings, monuments and places, it doesn't explicitly deal with them either. Article 2 of the Convention tells us that intangible cultural heritage is manifested inter alia in the following domains: oral traditions and expressions, including language as a vehicle of intangible cultural heritage; performing arts; social practices, rituals and festival events; knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe; and traditional craftsmanship. Now, in this definition, monuments, buildings and places are not explicitly recognised as what is referred to as manifestations of intangible cultural heritage. However, those of us who have invested many years into the conservation, documentation and recording of tangible cultural heritage know that places and monuments are often imbued with intangible values. They often become the nucleus around which community values coalesce, acting as keystones in the construction of cultural identities. What better organisation than ICOMOS, with its mixture of disciplines including architecture, archaeology, history, social science, social geography, anthropology, to involve itself in discussions about cultural heritage and the role of both tangible and intangible values in building cultural identity, or indeed their role in generating buildings, monuments and sites as productions of an evolving cultural system. Now, as an ICOMOS scientific committee, ICICH is still a fledgling. And to date, to be honest, our input into the ongoing international work of ICOMOS has been minimal. And our interactions with the operation of the convention have been very much from a position as a spectator on the sidelines. There are many reasons for this, including a lack of demonstrable experience generally in ICOMOS in this relatively new area of intangible cultural heritage, a lack of resources and income stream, and the lack of an underlying body of members engaging in work directly related to the objectives of the ISC who disseminate their work in the public domain. But the future is bright. This Australia ICOMOS NSC is part of a groundswell of interest from within ICOMOS that will contribute to the sustainable and effective future of the ISC and the work of ICOMOS in relation to intangible cultural heritage. Similar NSCs have been recently established in the UK and Mexico. There is a real opportunity to make a contribution if we focus our gaze on the intersection between the objectives of the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage and those of our parent organisation, ICOMOS. Now, Australia has long led the way internationally in areas such as community-based archaeology and the development of processes to involve local communities in the identification of heritage values and places. The Convention is firmly founded in the concept that intangible cultural heritage is community-based. Given this, I believe that the Australia NSC can make a vital contribution to the work of ICOMOS in exploring intangible values held by communities and demonstrating how they are connected to our cultural places. The Australia ICOMOS Borough Charter is a great example of how Australia ICOMOS, working to develop improved tools for application in our Australian domestic context, can influence international heritage practice. It's an excellent reminder that while our work relating to the World Heritage Convention is important, it is not by any means the only focus of the work of ICOMOS. We should never lose sight of the important role that ICOMOS must play in promoting cultural heritage conservation at regional and local levels as well. If we turn our attention now for the moment to the World Heritage Convention and look at the listing criteria, we again see the obvious interconnections between the tangible places and monuments that the Convention was established to protect and the intangible values that are reflected in them. We see this in criterions 1, 2, 6 and 7. Well, criterion 1, the human creative genius, the ultimate intangibility, incorporating as it does the mysterious workings of the human mind and our human ability to create, which sets us apart from other species. In criterion 2, we again note the interplay of the intangible exchange of human values with tangible outcomes of such exchange, such as architecture, technology and monuments. And criterion 6, perhaps philosophically the easiest to lay claim to, but arguably the hardest to satisfy, and I'll come back to it later because it's so important to our work. I throw 7 in as a teaser of sorts, because while this is dealt with as a natural criterion under the operational guidelines, and our IUCN colleagues claim that its assessment is not a qualitative process, and further that the value exists independent of the cultural domain, it has to be said that from the perspective of social scientists, the concept of aesthetics and of beauty are most clearly culturally constructed. They are connected to the intangible values of communities, and perhaps intriguingly, to particular groups within our communities, such as the natural scientists themselves. I'm conscious of the fact that the organisers of this symposium wanted an international case study, and I haven't provided one. In part, this is because I can't think of a good example of how we as ICOMOS have addressed the matter of intangible cultural heritage and its connections to place. There have been attempts to do so, but it must be acknowledged that as an organisation we've struggled, particularly with criterion 6, and specifically with those places claimed to be directly or tangibly associated with living traditions. We can see this struggle in the discussions of ICOMOS and the World Heritage Committee around the assessments of many nominations, such as China Dangxia. This was a site nominated for its natural values, but originally described by the state party in cultural terms. Fujisan, a sacred place and the source of artistic inspiration. And to some extent in the unsuccessful cultural nomination of Purnululu National Park. It's not only a problem for the advisory bodies and the committee, but often for the nominating state parties themselves, who struggle to articulate these values and their manifestations. This was certainly a large part of the problem in the abandoned Australian Cape York Peninsula Cultural Landscape nomination. The discussion during these and other similar nominations all centred on questions such as: how do we define and articulate such associations and living traditions? How can we compare them so as to establish OUV? How can such values be managed to reflect and incorporate these associations in the long-term conservation of the place? This was particularly relevant in the case of Purnululu. A consideration of these case studies involving criterion 6 directly goes to our capacity to understand, articulate and recognise intangible cultural values and the association between places and the dynamics of living traditions. It's no surprise that many of the dilemmas for ICOMOS and the World Heritage Committee in relation to intangible values arise from nominations from Asia and places of significance to the world's Indigenous peoples. This is especially true given that most of the tools used in the process have been developed by a cultural heritage system so deeply entrenched in Western philosophy and practice. We are at a stage in the evolution of the World Heritage Convention and the cultural heritage practice where we do acknowledge that such associations exist. And we can see them in practice. Indeed, we acknowledge that they make our world a richer place. However, so far, collectively, We have great difficulty in articulating them, and we have little idea how to manage such values without fossilising them. I think this is a good place for me to finish. It's the ideal place to deliver a message and to lay down a challenge. Your committee is forming at an interesting time when the world is ripe for consideration of new methodologies. The message is: you are well placed in Australia to tease out the theoretical and methodological issues involved in the consideration of intangible cultural values and their relationship with cultural heritage places. And for this reason, I challenge you all to generate and maintain a robust discussion on this matter, but don't just criticise. Develop ways to articulate the connections between intangible values and places, and raise the profile of intangible cultural heritage within government and the community in Australia, finding ways to demonstrate its relevance to all Australians. So on behalf of myself and my colleagues in the ISC, I wish you well with the symposium, and I look forward to the work of the NSC bubbling up to inject ideas, energy and publications that will help enrich the work of the International Scientific Committee on Intangible Cultural Heritage and ICOMOS generally in achieving our common goals. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.